So, good morning, everyone. Happy to see you here again. Today is the session number 8 of the RIEL Seminar Series 2024. And we would like to start with acknowledgements. So, we wish to pay our respects to the Larrakia people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. We also acknowledge all First Nations people across the lands on which we live and work, and pay our respects to elders both past and present. The rules of the game, I guess most of you are aware already, but the technicalities are that we aim for a maximum of 40 minutes presentation, followed by questions and answers. We have these overhead microphones here and there. So everything you say, every noise you make is gonna be captured. We are online and it's being recorded. So yeah, online participants, please keep yourself muted. And after that, we have hopefully the real morning tea for everybody. Everybody's invited. And last not least, we have potentially the fire alarm ringing. So just go back the way you entered the building, and the meeting point is behind me here in the lower floor. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So today we have a special guest here, which is internal, Dr. Keller Kopf. He's an ecologist, senior lecturer, has been in the university about 4 years, and he's also a member of the Freshwater, Estuarine and Marine Ecology Research Group. And he's also dealing with corporations from RIEL and other institutions eventually. His research combines field, laboratory, and statistical modeling to resolve fundamental research questions in ecology and conservation of fish and the environments they inhabit. So, Keller, the stage is yours, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Daniel. First of all, I'd like to thank my co-authors on this piece of work. It's a review paper this presentation is based on that we've drafted and sent out. We're currently revising, so it's actually a good time. It's been a useful process for me to put this into a presentation and present to you today, so I'm keen to get your feedback. But as Raphael said, I'm mainly a fish ecologist, and so we started with some ideas based primarily on literature associated with fish and fisheries, and it's expanded out to other taxonomic groups. So we've been lucky enough to have a whole bunch of people from different backgrounds contribute to this. So I'm certainly not the only person that's contributed to this.
I guess with the cooking, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I also would like to acknowledge the Larrakia people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay respect to their elders. And extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. So the focus of the presentation today really is to highlight the global extent of loss of old individual animals across a range of different taxa. And I guess highlight some individual case studies about why we think that's important from an ecological and a conservation perspective. It's important that you're aware that I'm talking about old individual animals, not just about megafauna or large old species. There's been a lot of research focused on that. And while a lot of the examples and the photos that you'll see here are examples from megafauna, not all of the species or old individuals that have important ecological roles are large predators or anything like that. Some of them are invertebrates. Some of them are, sponges, coral. Long-lived organisms play a vital role in a whole range of different ecosystems, and not all of them are incredibly long-lived or large. Species here, big-mouthed buffalo, looks a lot like a carp, common carp, which I'll talk about later, but it's very different. When thinking about doing a review on how or if old animals are important for ecology and conservation, it's important to define what terms we're talking about. This is a dwarf goby. This is a little fish that you can actually find out off the reefs here around Darwin. It's actually the shortest lived vertebrate on the planet, maximum lifespan of 59 days. So an old dwarf goby might be about 40 days old. A geriatric one is about 50 days old. So they don't live beyond 59 days as far as we know. Compare that with Greenland sharks. A recent study, well, relatively recent, 2016, verified the longevity of Greenland sharks is upwards of 400 years. 392 years, plus or minus 10 or 15 years was the estimate, on multiple individuals. So this individual shark that's photographed here was probably swimming around the oceans and probably about 100 years old when Captain Cook arrived in Australia. So very long lived. So an old individual for a Greenland shark might be 250, 350 years old, whereas a centenarian would be considered potentially young. Again, compare that to the Antarctic glass sponge, a species that is estimated to live beyond 15,000 years. So across the diversity of vertebrate and invertebrate life, we see a wide range of maximum longevities. The widest range is in invertebrates. We also have species that live in less than 24 hours. So a huge range of variation. Makes it really difficult to define what is actually an old animal or an old individual. It's a relative term. A 2-year-old mouse would be considered old, and a 20-year-old elephant probably quite young. Biologists and ecologists have realized this for quite a long time and associated it largely with fast and slow paces of life. Most of you probably would have heard of R-selected species and K-selected species. R-selected species being those that have relatively short lifespans, early maturity, fast growth, really high population turnover. They devote everything into a fast pace of life and reproduction, and then they usually have short lifespans. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have humans and elephants, which have a much slower pace of life. They tend to invest more in individual offspring, mature later, and a whole range of other traits. It's not quite as simple as that, and people have built off that R and K selection model more recently. And it turns out that rather than it being a two-dimensional continuum between R and K selected species, there's another dimension to this, which is periodic species, which they fall somewhere in the middle. They tend to be large, relatively long-lived, but also extremely fecund. They produce large numbers of offspring, but provide almost no parental care. So they're large and long-lived, species like marlin or giant clam, to some extent estuarine crocodile, but they provide very little parental care. Contrast that with K-selected species, which are also large, often large, relatively slow growing, but the key feature of these K-selected species is that they invest a lot in individual offspring, both in terms of energy. They tend to produce large offspring, and in many cases, in the extreme cases, they provide a lot of parental care. It's something that neither of these other groups do. Add to that, in the black letters here, increasingly we're trying to link those life history traits with behavioral traits, and they call them pace of life traits. And so in this review, we're trying to pull together an understanding of how behavioral traits also link with longevity. So for example, we tend to see short-lived, fast-growing species taking more risks, being bolder, and having a much faster metabolic rate in comparison to K-selected species. Comparing those short-lived, small-bodied species to periodic species, they tend to move less, have lower rates of dispersal, whereas these larger species move over long distances, either as adults, or in the case of species like giant clam, the young offspring disperse over long distances via river flows, or in the case of large old trees, wind. despite that the wide range of variation in life history strategies among vertebrates, one defining feature of pretty much all of those animals is that we all age. And the term aging itself is usually associated with the term senescence, which is basically a decline in the structure and function of the body over time. There are whole fields devoted to this. The gerontology is the study of aging, mostly in people. They use human models and also short-lived animal models like flies and mice to understand the drivers of aging, and call it sort of the fountain of youth research, trying to prolong lifespan and avoid or at least slow down that aging process. Aging and senescence is studied in wild animals, but it's much less common in comparison to human-based studies and also lab studies, using short-lived species like Drosophila and yeast. But that's not to say that senescence and aging hasn't been the focus of a lot of biological and ecological research. One of the first people to think about it was Alfred Russel Wallace. He's the guy who also happened to publish that paper a year before Darwin, prompting Darwin to write The Origin of Species. So he's a pretty sharp person by all accounts. And his view of old age, and the reason why there is a decline with age, is that essentially the purpose of life is to maximize lifetime reproductive output. And after a certain age, when you're not doing that, you decline and die, to the extent that you become an injury to the rest of the living population. It's a pretty derogatory statement. But to be fair, it's backed up by a lot of evidence. In a lot of mammals, there is a decline in reproductive value over time. So this is a graph of reproductive value of moose in relation to their age. And reproductive value there's a way of quantifying it. It's a unitless term, but it's basically the contribution of an individual to future generations. And it peaks usually and almost immediately after age at maturity, and then declines very rapidly. So there is some basis to that senescence focused paradigm of old age that, what is the value of a 12 or a 15-year-old moose? From a purely reproductive point of view, probably not very much. But contrast that perspective with old growth trees, and we have a very different perspective of old growth trees. The conservation and ecological values of old growth trees are much more widely appreciated. We're still cutting down old growth trees, but there are quite substantial conservation efforts and research efforts going in to understand why old growth trees are important. Of course, animals are fundamentally different from trees, but they do share some similarities. One of those similarities is that there is size-selective and age-selective harvest of animals. And in some species of animal, they share similar life histories. Like I talked about before, the giant sequoia tree, while it's not an animal, produces large numbers of tiny propagules that disperse into the wind. Similarly, a striped marlin produces large numbers of propagules that are dispersed into the ocean environment, largely without parental care. Many of these, what we call periodic and also equilibrium species, are long-lived. They tend to have long lifespans. And they also have something that we're calling the old animal storage effect. Similar to old growth forests, they accumulate biomass over long periods of time in their environment. That's part of the defining feature of equilibrium or K-selected species and also periodic species. Because of their long lifespans, they have relatively stable populations that accumulate large amounts of biomass over long periods of time. that's the case in the absence of significant anthropogenic pressures. So without fisheries or size selective harvesting, many of those large, long-lived old animals historically had high biomass. And that old animal storage effect does two really important things. One thing that it does is buffer those populations from years when there's low recruitment or environmental variation. So those long-lived individuals persist through a wide range of environmental conditions, climate extremes, and if they don't reproduce one year, that's okay. If they don't reproduce another year, that's okay. Eventually, that reproduction, that they survive long enough in their environment to contribute those offspring to the population. A really good example of this is bigmouth buffalo. They're a freshwater fish species in North America. They live in river floodplain environments. It might be the longest lived species of freshwater fish. This individual is 125 years old. And people using otoliths have looked at their recruitment patterns, the survival of young fish to maturity, and have found that there have only been 13 successful recruitment events between 1894 and 1997. So undergoing long periods of time without successful recruitment. And 85% of the individuals in this population are estimated to be over 80 years old. The even more confronting thing about this is these animals are treated in a similar way to how we treat common carp. They're actually considered, they use the term trash fish in North America. So fishermen that catch them usually just throw them on the bank and get rid of them because they're not trout or considered sport fish. That perspective, there are a lot of people pushing for change in that, but so they're also threatened by a range of anthropogenic pressures. So these long-lived animals can contribute to recruitment and population persistence over long periods of time, but another really important contribution that they make is over those time periods, they accumulate knowledge and experience. And that's why we've used the word wisdom in the title. Some people think it might be an anthropocentric perspective, but I think there's probably an argument to be made that some animals are wise. So these losses of old animals are happening both in aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial environments. Recent research has shown that across 5 large ocean areas, the oldest age classes of fish have declined by more than 90% in comparison to historical conditions. Extremely old coral species that are over 800 years old are being harvested, but those populations and those individuals are essentially irreplaceable in human lifespans. There's nothing that we can do within a human lifespan that will facilitate the recovery of an 800-year-old individual. We're also seeing other species of aquatic fauna, sharks, sawfish, substantial declines in size, but because many of these species are ectotherms and they grow throughout their life with indeterminate growth, size and age are inherently linked. So this individual, this is a sawfish. Some debate whether it's a freshwater sawfish or a green sawfish. I'll leave it to the experts in the room to figure out. But in any case, it's a large and probably was a very old animal as well. While the size and age of those individuals probably historically were not considered common, they made up a much higher proportion of the biomass of those populations than they do now. This is off Queensland, by the way, in 1966. So. And when those old animals are lost from populations, what it causes is something we call age truncation. It's essentially the removal of old age classes. And forgive the really crappy scan. This is an old textbook. It's like a fisheries handbook of population dynamics. And what this figure is showing is the age distribution of this species in the absence of fishing which is this big curve here, and under different scenarios of fishing mortality. This is done by Bill Ricker, who was essentially one of the sort of grandfathers of modern fisheries population dynamics. So again, this distribution of here age relative to biomass is without fishing, but with a fishing mortality of 0.4, which is roughly equivalent to 40% of the population being harvested. That's the biomass that you lose here on the right. So essentially, almost all individuals older than 8 years old are completely eliminated from that population. 8 to 10, there's probably still a few individuals left, but individuals older than 14 years old, which historically comprised a reasonable amount of the biomass of that population, they don't exist. And 0.4% fishing mortality for people who are interested in fisheries science is a very low rate of fishing mortality. Fishing mortality in global oceans are closer to 0.8, which is why we're seeing a 90% decline in old age individuals from most fisheries around the world. And the reason why fisheries do this is because they're size selective. They tend to harvest the biggest and oldest individuals first, and over time, they focus on smaller, younger individuals, resulting not only, since these fisheries are harvesting multiple species, it's not just happening within individual populations, it's happening within communities. So we're seeing whole communities shifted to younger age structures, but also the composition of species shifting to younger, faster growing, more sort of R-selected species. And as you can imagine, that shift in community composition from old, large individuals that often feed at high trophic positions down to smaller, younger individuals and faster growing species has a broad impact on the structure and function of ecosystems. This is a simplified conceptual model of a trophic pyramid for an open ocean environment. Many aquatic ecosystems, the primary producers which supply the entire food web are small organisms. They're phytoplankton or algae. Phytoplankton and algae are considered R-selected species. They're really fast growing, very high turnover. So in the environment, they don't accumulate a lot of biomass, but they supply the whole food chain with energy and food. So they have a fast turnover. But as you move up the food web to herbivores, omnivores, and predators, those species tend to be longer lived. And because they're longer lived, they accumulate larger amounts of standing biomass in the environment. But when those large, old individuals are harvested, we see a range of changes to food webs. One of the key changes that we see is a reduction in the trophic position of individual animals, because smaller individuals tend to consume lower trophic position animals, and larger animals tend to consume higher trophic position animals. So we see a reduction in trophic position. We also see more variability or fluctuations in the population sizes of animals in those communities, because those large old individuals, like old growth trees, provide stability in structure and function, and their populations are not as variable as those with high turnover. These changes are not only happening in the oceans and in rivers, they're happening on land. Threatening processes including poaching, trophy hunting, culling of predators are all reducing the age of animals. It's not usually deliberately targeting old individuals. These processes are usually selecting larger individuals or their traits, particularly in terrestrial animals. People tend to focus on horns or antlers or manes, but the result of that is reduction in the age structure. And it often leads to, in terrestrial animals, a sex-biased age structure, because many of the traits that are being selected for are traits of males, like antlers and horns. So it can change a lot of things, but it can also change the social and cultural aspects of these populations with important impacts on population dynamics. This is a male lion in Africa. Collaborator Phyllis Lee has been working there for pretty much all of her career, mainly studying elephants, but she supplied this picture. And what they're seeing with predator culling or trophy hunting in Africa is that when these old males are killed, a new male comes in and kills all of the previous, the cubs from the previous father. So the removal of those older males is resulting in something called infanticide. It's a pretty well-established change. Just one example. So it's not only that we're having these losses of old individuals, but another important component of this is that there's an increasing body of research that's demonstrating the unique ways in which old individual animals contribute to a range of biological and ecological processes very different to the narrow focus on declining reproductive output with age. We're seeing in many species, if not most vertebrates, reproductive value actually doesn't decline with age. Really important consequences of information being acquired over time by old individuals, and that information being transmitted to younger generations to assist with migration, locating food during drought, identifying spawning locations. A whole range of information that's gathered over time is actually transmitted between old and young age classes of animals. I'll only have time to talk about some of these examples today, but the one that really got me started thinking about this process was this paper. Diego Barnesch, he's actually at Ames in Perth. They reviewed the reproductive output of 394 species of marine fish in relation to female body mass. And you remember back to that figure that I showed about the declining reproductive value of moose over time. That doesn't happen with fish. Fish grow indeterminately throughout their lifespan, and they actually produce greater numbers of offspring per unit of body mass as they get bigger. We've known this for some time, but what this particular paper showed is it's not only that there's an increase over time, it's a disproportionate increase. So it's a hyperallometric scaling of reproductive output with size, and which is highly correlated with age. And you might think, okay, well, that's all right. That's interesting from a biological perspective. But it's fundamentally important to fisheries management, because one 30-kilogram fish is the equivalent of 37 2-kilogram fish in terms of reproductive value. The way that most fisheries population models work is they just assume biomass is biomass. It doesn't matter if you're a mature fish and there's 37 kilograms of you, you're going to contribute the same thing as a 37-kilogram adult. Whereas that's not the case. The reproductive value of that individual fish is substantially more than these small mature individuals. And this seems to be a common pattern for most commercially harvested marine fish, which have this same life history strategy. But the same is true for actually birds, I was surprised to find, which are not ectotherms. Generally, older birds produce more offspring and often produce more viable offspring. Most reptiles, it applies to most amphibians, crustaceans, and mollusks. So in mammals, it is common that reproductive value declines with age, but for most other vertebrates and many invertebrates, it's just not the case. So that's reproductive value. As I mentioned, another really important aspect of this is knowledge acquisition over time and the impacts that it has on culture. Oscar Wilde pointed out that with age comes wisdom, but sometimes only age comes alone. Certainly true of some people, but it's also true of animals. And one of the best examples of this is actually human evolution. A defining feature of human evolution is an extended post-reproductive lifespan in women. So women survive well beyond when they stop reproducing. This is kind of an evolutionary enigma, because if you go back to Russell and his idea, well, you're completely useless after you stop reproducing. Why do humans have a post-reproductive lifespan, a very long one? And the answer to this is grandmothers are really important. Grandmothers increase the number of grand offspring that their daughters produce, and they increase the survival rate of their grand offspring. And this has been demonstrated in a range of mostly sort of historical non-industrialized societies. As I don't know what the grandmother hypothesis says about modern societies, but the way humans evolved, grandmothers were fundamentally important in the survival of their grand offspring. Some really amazing studies. Someone who's helped shape this paper is Virpi Luma, and she's been studying families in Finland, human evolution in Finland. They have these incredibly well-documented records of family histories. And that's one of the places where they've actually verified that this grandmother hypothesis actually holds true, both in terms of the number of grandkids that are produced, but also their individual survival and then subsequent contribution to future generations. And this is now cascaded down to other animals, non-human animals. It's been demonstrated in elephants and also whales. One of our collaborators on this paper is Lauren Brent. She's documented the grandmother effect in killer whales. This paper in particular demonstrated that during times of food scarcity, well, a key food item for killer whales in the Atlantic is Chinook salmon, depicted here. As you can imagine, being such a large predator, finding food and keeping your kids fed and your grandkids fed and yourself fed, it's a big ask. Killer whales also have an extended post-reproductive lifespan. Actually, tends to be longer than humans, actually. What she found is that the grandmother killer whales are the ones that find food during times of food scarcity. The fathers and the grandfathers sit back and watch, and the grandmothers and the daughters and their kids find the food. And the key bit is that the daughters and the granddaughters follow the grandmother, and they learn that information, so they know where to find the salmon when food is scarce. Very similar cultural influences of old individual animals in African elephants, but extends both to grandfathers and grandmothers. Grandmothers tend to be the source of knowledge, similar to killer whales, on where to find food and where to navigate things. Grandfathers tend to regulate the social structures in packs of elephants. So in places where old male elephants have been taken out of these populations, the younger males get really disruptive. They're more aggressive toward other elephants. They're more aggressive toward non-elephant things, non-elephant animals. They stampede more often in terms of go into cities and cause problems. So it actually, removal of these old male African elephants increases rates of human-wildlife conflict. But it's not just people. Whales and elephants, these effects are cascading down to us less clever fish people are finally realizing that some of this stuff might actually apply to species that we work with. And there have been some important studies published recently. In particular, a good example that Osmar pointed out to me is the Nassau grouper. They're a large, long-lived species of coral reef fish. And they've been the old individuals of populations of Nassau grouper have been harvested pretty heavily. And what's happened around the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico is that previously abundant spawning aggregations just ceased to exist. There are still old groupers around in particular places, and there are high densities of small individuals, but the spawning aggregations are not happening. And what they're finding is that the old individuals have been depleted to such high levels that they're not actually able to lead migration events to the spawning grounds. And so the young individuals, it's not just inherent in species that they know where to go to breed and to find food. Much of this is learned, and much of it's learned through older individuals. So yeah, I think a plug for research in this area. There's definitely a need for more research on species other than elephants and killer whales. It seems very likely that it's something that's quite a bit more widespread. So despite this really well-recognized loss and increasing appreciation of old individual animals, the harvest of old animals still is essentially the basis of most fisheries and wildlife harvest management guidelines. Nothing has changed in that regard, and those that are considered well-managed and sustainable, you can have a population of fish where essentially every individual that's a few years older than age at maturity is completely removed from that population. Now imagine if we harvested or removed every human that was over the age of 20 from our population, what would happen? There would be a lot of potential societal changes. We're actually doing that to fish and wildlife population. We're harvesting them down as close as we can to that age at maturity. And historically, and it holds true, that results in a really high level of production in terms of fisheries catches. Whether or not it's sustainable in the long run is actually a question, because what we're finding is that a lot of these fish stocks aren't able to persist through environmental variability and changes over time. And you're cutting it pretty close by harvesting these populations down right to the size at maturity and not keeping those older individuals around. But it's not just a fisheries and wildlife management problem, it's a conservation issue as well. The IUCN doesn't recognize truncated age structures in any of their assessment criteria. So if you have a large number of individuals in terms of population size, it's fine. Perhaps all of the older age classes have been extirpated from that population. It doesn't play into assessments of whether or not those species are threatened. I don't have time to go into sort of management and conservation options, but it's actually not rocket science. The same things that we're using, if we use them in more directed ways, work to protect old and large individuals. Networks of protected areas, time area closures, there are particular places and times where large and old individuals aggregate, particularly spawning aggregations, which makes them more vulnerable to harvest. And you can focus on limiting harvest during those time periods. In fisheries, there's also size and age-based harvest strategies to protect those old individuals. That works. Catch and release fishing is another method that works for some species. So there are a range of very practical management strategies that, with a bit more consideration, could be used to effectively conserve those demographics of old individuals. So yeah, I'll just end with a plug for longevity conservation as something that I think it's an underappreciated aspect of biodiversity in the broad sense. We think about the conservation of species and we think about population sizes, but we don't think about age structures. So age structure itself is an essential dimension of biodiversity. Like all growth trees, we're removing them, and they have really important ecological functions and hugely important ecosystem service functions. Most of the world's protein is supplied through fisheries. So there are a range of really important ecosystem service benefits that are being eroded as these old individuals are lost from populations. So I'm trying to leave some time for questions, but I'll leave that to the real moderators. Yeah. Any questions?
That was great, thanks. I've just got I guess a bit of an obvious question about standard fishing, recreational fishing regulations, which actually forces you to take the bigger fish. So what are your thoughts? I mean, it seems to be around the wrong way, doesn't it? That you should take smaller fish and leave the bigger fish.
Completely, yeah. Where catch and release can work, where you can catch the fish and release it and it survives, the best strategy is what they call it a slot limit. So you can keep fish between a particular minimum size and a particular maximum size. So you're conserving the individuals up to the point of maturity, and then after maturity, you can harvest them around that stage, but then you're also protecting the older individuals. And there are places, and it is a management strategy that exists. But it's not put in place in a lot of places. It doesn't work in some places. One thing that Michael Usher, who's a new PhD student here, is working on is the post-release survival of reef fish from recreational fisheries. Some fish they don't survive after being caught. So the best management strategy, if you're going to catch them, is to take those and move on, not to, if you catch a whole bunch of those fish and they're going to die anyway, and you keep fishing and releasing them, catch and release actually is a counterproductive strategy. So I said it's kind of deceiving that it is a simple management solution that I said. It's not, it's very context specific, but the point I guess I was trying to make is that, yeah, there are management strategies in place that can easily protect these age demographics. Jenny.
Thanks, Keller. That was great, and it's not just because I'm old. I remember when that paper by Pauline came out about fishing down the food chain, and there was a lot of shock and horror amongst my marine colleagues that we're going to end up with oceans full of jellyfish because nothing eats jellyfish, although turtles eat jellyfish. But do you know if any follow-up work's been done as to are jellyfish numbers increasing worldwide, or is it too short?
The short answer to that is one, yes, jellyfish numbers increase. There's a positive correlation between overfishing and jellyfish abundance. Particularly places like the Mediterranean have been overrun with jellyfish. And it's also a place where many of the fisheries are considered unsustainable. So yeah, there's definitely a correlation there. That fishing down the food web concept, it's been criticized for various reasons, but the overall trend that fisheries tend to harvest large individuals that often feed at high trophic positions it's pretty well established, and it's been refined a bit. But yeah, there is strong evidence for basically a top-down trophic cascade in many places.
Thanks, Keller. That was great. And I'll say that because I am one. Ask you, I know it's not your work, but I was going to ask you a bit more information about the buffalo that you mentioned. That only had 13.
Yeah.
recruiting events over like 100-year period.
Yeah.
So do you have any idea what caused that and how, how common is that
Yeah.
sort of phenomenon?
Yeah, I've thought about that. It's a good question. So the bigmouth buffalo fish in the Missouri River, they've only detected 13 successful recruitment events since the late 1800s. And it's likely that's probably, that length of time is not kind of the natural duration between successful recruitment events. It's very likely attributed to river regulation and the fact that in most places in the Missouri River, the floodplains are not inundated, which is the cue and the location of where these fish breed. So the most of the fish that were sampled for this aging study were sampled from a reservoir that's a dammed river. And they still move into creeks that feed into the reservoir, but they're just not quite as successful. But yet they're still persisting. It just shows that, yeah, for species with that kind of lifespan, the actual ability to persist is quite astounding based on their longevity. But yeah, probably not natural. Yeah, but due to river regulation. Gentlemen.
The loss of the old and the wise is such an obvious thing, but I noticed that you specifically talk about grandmothers.
Yeah.
You don't talk about grandfathers or great-grandfathers, and this seems to be the problem. You've only got to look at politics across the world. Whatever country you look at, usually looking at old men who are making decisions, and old men who are making decisions about the fish rather than younger people.
Yeah.
So it seems to be as though a problem as humans, which has caused this whole problem, is the fact that we think that old men are wise and should make decisions in a world that we can see is falling apart. And yet, most of the people who now understand conservation or understand the need for it are all young people. But old people, particularly if you look at somewhere like America, we're not talking about grandfathers, we're talking about great-grandfathers.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of,
It's an interesting point, and I've thought about it. One of the reasons from the evolutionary perspective that it hasn't been the focus is that there isn't that men don't go through menopause. Doesn't happen, but it happens in women. That's the evolutionary side of it. But in terms of the social side of it in humans, this is the term sage. It's based on old, mostly white men. And it's that, if you look up the term wisdom, it's basically synonymous with a sage. The presumption that wisdom is actually old men. But in animal populations, it's quite clear that it may not be the case.
Because no one seems to want to admit the fact that there's too many humans already. We still seem to be sad that people are concerned that Japan's population is aging and they're saying this is terrible. And yet when you look at the consumption of fish by Japan compared to any other country, it's atrocious. They take more, I think about 4 times more per population for their fish than any other country in the world. And yet we think, it's terrible that the population of Japan's going down. Why doesn't it make sense that we should say, look, there's got to be a stop to just everyone using the oceans, which is what's actually happening at the moment.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you've said there.
Well, I don't want you to agree. Get angry.
This is a question from Tegan online. Do you have any thoughts on why so few species have evolved menopause given the benefits of grandmother pet?
Good question. I think it's to do with, I don't know. I don't have a short answer to that question. It's a really good question. I think there's a big one explanation is the cognitive ability to contribute at that level, that you actually, your knowledge is accumulated to such an extent that you actually have fundamental benefits to the survival of your grand offspring. So I think there's a cognitive aspect of it. Elephants, killer whales, and humans are very intelligent. I'm not saying there's a lot of really interesting stuff with fish, but they don't have the cognitive abilities of humans or whales. So I think there's a cognitive element of being able to, the culture, the complexity of the culture as well is a really important part of it.
Yeah, just indirectly to Tegan's question. So my one is just on senescence. So, I mean, I'm not in this space, but I'm just thinking, well, for human beings, when we are growing, we have something called age-related diseases. So if you look at the grandmother concept, and in literature, have you come across, some of these, like as they grow old, then naturally there's, these age-related diseases that may limit their functions.
Yeah, there's no doubt that all of those things happen and they're important, and some grandmothers don't survive because of those senescence. Senescence 100% happens in most of these species. Jellyfish are an interesting example. Apparently they don't age, but it just demonstrates that how important that contribution is, that if you can survive and not die of cancer or not die of all of these things as your body declines, there's a massive benefit to the evolution of your species. That's what it's saying. For some of those species, that the survival of those individuals is so important that we've figured out ways. Well, there's also quite a lot to show that longer lived species have very different immune systems that allow them to resist pathogens. That's how they live longer. And there's the guy who sent me this photo, Bill Baker. He is in the US. He studies these Antarctic glass sponges. They live for 15,000 years. All of his funding comes through human gerontology research to find how do these things live so long? What's the gene? How do they actually do that? Because it's quite remarkable that they can, despite disease, viruses, predators, everything.
The sponges are a bit different than most other things you're talking about there, because basically they really aren't an animal at all anyway. They're basically about 5 different cells.
Yeah.
That basically seem to live together. You can put a sponge in a food processor, strain it out through silt, freeze it if you want to, and then if you put it back into the right sort of water, salty water with it, it'll reform. Now there's nothing else on this earth that can do that. Yes, I suppose you can cut an earthworm in half and you get 2 earthworms. But so you're looking at
very different
650 million years of evolution, and that's sort of like that's how you survive. And you survive. You can be 4 miles down under the sea, and there's sponges and stuff.
Yeah, they are. They're fundamentally different organisms. I don't deny that.
How do they estimate that age?
Sorry?
How do they estimate that age?
I don't know.
That's one thing I was really wondering, like issue values, things like that.
Carbon dating, probably. Yeah, they're calcium carbonate, so.
Count the rings.
Any other questions? Comments? So thanks a lot, Keller. That was really interesting. Yeah, I'll see you in 2 weeks, hopefully. And we have the real morning tea waiting in yellow too. Everybody's invited. Thank you very much for being here.